All right, so at the end of the last video, which was on Neil deGrasse Tyson, there was a image of Richard Dawkins in the audience, and so I decided I would do something on him next. Now, I've read a couple of his books, but I wasn't sure. I don't watch his videos per se, so I had to go explore YouTube, and he has a channel called, let's take a look here, The Poetry of Reality with Richard Dawkins. I was just starting to go through some of his, just looking at the thumbnails of his videos, and one of them kind of jumped out at me, and it was a panel of 4 people and a host. One of the people in the panel was, of course, Richard Dawkins, and the title is Why Are We Here? And so I decided this is the one I ought to be looking at, so I watched the video, and it was very interesting. This is going to be an interesting one to examine, so let's just go ahead and take a look.
The mystery of existence is indeed a deeply profound mystery, and a biologist is perhaps best qualified of anybody to expound this mystery, because at least until 1859, it was a total mystery. The facts of life being both highly complex, almost unbelievably complex, and also carrying a gigantic illusion of design. Living things appear to have design written all over them. And this applies to the deepest levels of complexity as well as superficial levels. Complexity first. The human brain has about 86 billion neurons and about 600 trillion connections between them. And if you were to count up the number of nerve impulses that are rocketing through your, like rifle bullets through your brain at the moment, it would be something like 4 quadrillion of these clicks, these impulses per second. Complexity of the brain, complexity of the rest of the body, every animal and plant, every bacterium is prodigiously complicated. The illusion of design, you can see this every time you see a camouflaged insect, a stick insect, a stick caterpillar, a leaf insect, a stick caterpillar that has carved on its exterior leaf scars, perfect mimicry of a real stick, butterflies that have perfect mimicry of a leaf. Everything about a living organism screams at you, it's designed. And until Darwin came along, that's what most people thought, almost everybody thought. Darwin had the effrontery almost to realize that it was possible that all this complexity and this illusion of design could come about through blind mechanical forces, evolution by natural selection.
All right, so Dawkins says that when he looks at cells and sees their properties, that design screams at him. Yet even with all this screaming in his ear, he still wants to pivot and say, well, there is no design, which is bizarre to me. I mean, if it's screaming design, why not just say it's design? If the sky is blue, why you say that it's a different color? If we double the mass and it looks like it doubles the amount of gravity, then why don't we just say that there is a relationship there, and so on? And then, well, with this counter argument for why it looks designed, why there's this an illusion of design, and he proposes evolution, and to be more precise, the parts of evolution where we have mutation and natural selection. So let's look at these two mechanics just briefly. Let's look at the mechanic of mutation. There's lots of mutations. We have frame shifts and deletions, insertions, and so on, and they all, from a coder perspective or a linguist perspective, someone writes a book, if you start plucking letters out, if you start putting in zeros and ones to shift things over, replacing a zero with the one, you wreck things, you destroy things. You don't come up with new novel pieces of code, or you don't come up with a new a book doesn't evolve into another book by slowly changing out letters and grammatical, spaces and things. It doesn't. It wrecks it. It destroys information. It's there. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows it wrecks it and destroys it. You have to go through this desert of possibilities of change before you come up to this oasis where it actually works again. So that doesn't make much sense. And then you look at the natural selection part, which he argues that it's directed and it ratchets things up. There's an arms race and it's being pushed in a certain direction. And yet to me it looks very random. What survives if you do get a positive mutation, something that doesn't wreck the system and it does get manifest into the organism? How long does that organism survive? Can it survive to maturity and actually push that change into the next set of offspring, or does it die before it can have a chance to do that? Does it get swallowed up amongst all the other code that's competing against it, and you got this one little tiny light that's trying to shine through all this other code, is trying to swallow it up? And when it makes this change and the environment changes, or they migrate 50 miles and the environment change, and that little longer nose, that little thicker hair all suddenly isn't relevant anymore, then what happens? Because the climate changed, or they moved to a different location, or the predators changed. And there's the idea that you have to have this simultaneous change to make an organism go faster. The idea is not you change one little piece of protein and then it manifests itself as something that sees better or runs faster. There's this complexity of having to change lots of genes all at the same time, all in the same direction, to get the eye to evolve to see better, focus better, or whatever. You have to have the lacrimal glands change. You can't have the dry ball dry out. You have to have the muscles that attach to the lens that pull on it to get it to focus. You have to have the cells that deposit material to make the lens, and you have to have the retina, the blood flow, the muscles that control where the eye points. All of these things have to be mutating at the same time to get that positive outcome that you're interested in. You can't just change one little piece at a time. And then you look at the machinery. And it seems like the cell recognizes this and it tries to use it as an advantage, and it seems to recognize the destructive effects of mutation. It spends a lot of energy looking over its code and making sure there are no errors and fixing them and having machinery in place that will look for errors, fix them, and when it decides that, hey, maybe I would like to capitalize on this mutation phenomenon. This is a pretty popular idea in terms of our immune system. When it has an invader and it wants to find a little product, a protein that it wants to build to have it be able to attach to another one of these invaders, to change its properties so that it can't do what it normally does. It switches off this correction mechanism, this proofreading, this anti-mutation machinery that's inside the cell. It turns that off and says, okay, well, for this one event, we'll let things mutate. And so we can make one single product that isn't relying upon other products working in concert to make a positive change. We'll change this one little product, this one protein, then we'll spit that protein out through our cell membrane, and then see if it attaches and has a deleterious effect on that cell. Will it attach to it and change its outer properties so it can no longer attach itself to a healthy cell, and if it can't, we'll just keep spitting out these tiny little changes, and once we've solved that little problem, we'll shut it off. We'll shut off this mutation thing, and then we'll go back because the cell seems to know that in general that these mutations are harmful and they don't help it at all. So when you talk about the machinery of life and what it's capable of doing, and you see this screaming of design, why don't we just accept it and say, yes, this is obviously designed. What's the harm? Why is it such a difficult thing to say, hey, maybe there really is a designer here? And what a powerful thing to discover, to actually come up with this idea that, yeah, there is a design, there is a person out there who, what's the design all about? What's my role in it? What's my function here? Now I have purpose. Now I have meaning in my life. What is this purpose? What is this meaning? What does the designer intend for me? Aren't these wonderful things? Aren't these powerful things? Why do we want to squash these ideas? You know, I don't understand the advantage of saying, you know, trying to squash this idea that there is a designer. And anyway, let's take a listen to a little more of this. I can't really call it a lecture. The four hosts kind of giving their opinion on various things. There's quite a bit more content that's very enlightening. So let's go ahead and jump to that.
Okay. Richard Swinburne, you've got an argument, quite a famous argument for why the cause of the world, talking about causality, would have to be a person rather than some prior physical fact. Why it'd have to be something, a person, some non-physical consciousness that kicked off the Big Bang rather than something else.
Yes, but just let me make two other remarks first. I have no quarrel at all with anything Richard Dawkins said. I entirely agree. But the question is, why is these laws operative? And the answer is, of course, because, as you said, the laws of physics are crucial here. But then why are the laws of physics operative? And, okay, there's a multiverse. But that will only produce these laws if it itself has laws. And so in the end, you are left with the laws of science. And the laws of science postulate that everything in the world, it might be the atoms of our world or the chunks of the so-called nothingness in the big space out of which universes evolve, behaves in exactly the same way. And that's what law-likeness means. And it means that everything, just to take that we're talking about atoms, but the same applies to whatever the constitution of the multiverse is, it behaves in exactly the same way. And the question is why? It's no good just saying there's a law of nature. The law of nature just is that they behave in this way, full stop. So why do they behave in this way? And there are a large number of separate things. And unless something causes them to behave in the same way, we're left once again with a multitude of things. And that's why I think there's no scientific explanation of these things, because scientific explanation just consists in postulating that a lot of things behave in exactly the same way. And we want something a little simpler than that. And in fact, there is a model of causality, which is the question you were coming on to.
Just before we do the model of causality, can we give Richard an opportunity to...
I find this the most extraordinary idea. Richard Swinburne is saying that we need a special explanation for why every electron, every proton, every neutron, every particle behaves in exactly the same way. How could they not behave in the same way? They're all the same kind of thing. That's what they do.
Well, why are the constitutions of the universe exactly the same kind of thing? If you define the kind of thing in terms of its powers, and I agree that's a reasonable way to do it, why are all the things in the universe have the same powers in the sense of attracting, for example, every other one in accordance with Newton's law of gravity or whatever else the law is? That question remains.
There are two separate questions there. One is, why do these particles have the properties that they do? And that is a profound question. The other is, why do they all have the same properties, which is the one you're stressing?
Yeah.
And that's not profound at all. Yeah. That simply follows from the...
Right. Well, I mean, in that case, I mean, if you say they have the same powers because that's what they are, the question then is, why are all the things in the universe the same in this respect, that they have the power to attract every other body in the universe in accordance with mm-r². That is why it remains.
If you are saying that you need a God to explain why all these electrons and protons are behaving the same way, a God capable of doing that would have to be supremely complicated, and yet you're saying that he's supremely simple.
Why do you think he's got to be exceedingly complicated?
Because he's got to hold all these electrons in his little hands, How can he
No,
possibly
he's
be
not
simple?
that sort of God at all. He has no extension in space.
Okay, I think that's obviously a trivial point.
But that comes back to the question of causality, in fact, because there is a model of causality which is entirely not the scientific one, which we use all the time. The nature of a scientific model of causality is it postulates laws of nature acting on initial states, producing from them other states. But if you are, the model of personal action is not at all like that. If you ask anyone of the audience, why are you here? They're not saying, well, there was a scientific law in virtue of which, etc., which led to my being here. They say, well, there were some interesting talks going on, I believe. I believe that they are coming at this time and that the way to get there is this. And I have the purpose of having these, and I have the purpose of getting here. So we explain all human behavior in terms of the powers of humans, in terms of their beliefs about what the effects of their actions will be, and in virtue of their desires to produce these beliefs. And that is a model by which we explain ordinary human behavior, which of course consists in a large number of atoms buzzing around in our bodies. But what explains them is something fairly simple: me.
All right, so this section was really interesting to me. And while I was listening to Richard Swinburne talking, I was having like little fireworks going on in my head. But I need to unpack it. It's going to take just a little bit to unpack what is going on here. He's talking about, we live in a cause and effect world. We are born, literally born, doesn't matter what religion you are, what your background is, what your worldview is. You are born surrounded by cause and effect, because we are born within the universe that is cause and effect. We expect to see cause and effect solutions or explanations. We're biased that way. And then Richard Swinburne talks about particles, electrons, gravity, electrons always behaving the same way, protons always behaving the same way. And what's he trying to get at with that? He's trying to show you that when we talk about science, we're deceived a little bit. We think that we understand a lot about how the world works, and yet we really don't. Take gravity, for example. We say we have the law of gravity, but does that explain exactly how gravity works? And if you start examining it, it doesn't. The law of gravity only looks at relationships. It describes what will happen if I take a particle of a certain mass and put it in a gravitational field of a certain size. It'll be a certain force will act upon it. There's no explanation as to what a force is. There's no explanation as to how something can pull something magically through empty space. All these fundamental ideas, fields, forces, energy, there's no explanation for it. So science lacks explanatory power. It's good at describing patterns. One pattern, again, that Richard Swinburne is talking about, is a pattern of all similar things acting in a similar way. And I guess the pattern of how do they actually behave? And so going back to, say, the electron, if we have two electrons and they're a certain distance apart, well, how they'll behave is they'll repel with a certain force and so on, even though we don't know why they do any of these things. And then at the very end, he starts talking, the most interesting part for me, he starts looking at the cause of humans, and he gives the story of deciding to go to listening to him in this lecture here. They have this belief, I think the word he used, that it's going to be at a certain time, a certain location, and he moves his body and gets in the car and goes there and goes and sits down in expectation that this lecture is going to occur. And the cause of all this, change of behavior to get him to be in the lecture room, is himself. He is the cause. And so now we have to go into a religious context. as I was listening to Richard Swinburne, I was immediately drawn into a book I'd read called The Lectures on Faith by Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith, this, as if you're LDS, you know that the Lectures of Faith were part of the Doctrine and Covenants, and later removed because they were not considered revelation. But they were lectures given, a series of 6 lectures, I think, maybe there's 7. First of which he talks about faith, and then you could basically take all of Richard Swinburne's ideas and alter a few of the words, and you would have lecture number 1 on the lectures on faith. You have to substitute the word faith for his belief. For Joseph Smith uses the word faith as how the causation effect. When Richard Swinburne is talking about what causes the person to be able to move, have this belief system to be able to move their body, get their arm to move, get their body to walk, know that the lecture is going to occur, have all of these instruments of causation. The Joseph Smith book tries to emphasize that is called faith. This cause effect, this causal effect is called faith. Now, what's interesting about that, and I was thinking about this afterwards, after I had listened to this part that Richard had talked about, it dawned on me that LDS doctrine is pretty clear on the fact that what I am, what allows me to be the cause of my own motion. That's what I was thinking of when Richard said that, and the idea struck me that, well, I am an eternal agent. I am outside of this cause and effect universe. It's hard to wrap my mind around what eternal means or infinite means, but that's the realm that I exist in. I was an intelligence before, I existed forever, and now I am put into a cause and effect universe. But that doesn't deny me the ability to have faith that I can cause things to happen. That I am the source of the cause of things to happen, and not this empty gray area where science cannot describe anything. So I thought that was really fascinating that Richard would bring that up, and the interesting connections with my own religious faith. All right, so this is a big idea here. It has to soak. You have to let it soak just for a minute. We live in a cause and effect universe. I'm stuck in this, yet I am eternal. Let that soak for a minute. We don't know why things behave the way they do. We don't know why electrons behave the way they do. We don't know why things with mass are attracted to each other through this thing we call gravity. We use words to label effects, but we don't know why they happen. Science has lots of labels, but when you come down to the fundamental reasoning for why they do what they do, we don't know. Yet here we are, the cause of our own motion. And how are we able to cause our own motion, to have my hand move the way it is across the screen right now? How am I able to do that? Well, the label Joseph Smith applies is faith. That's the causal agent. And I am the source of that, because I am eternal. I am outside the cause and effect universe that we live in. I'm allowed to do that because of those properties that I have, these eternal properties that I have. I become the effect. I'm the effective agent. So let that soak. And let's go on to the next idea.
Well, Richard Swinburne a moment ago said any scientifically minded person would believe that God is the ultimate cause. What is it about this explanation that you're not happy to entertain, Richard? Is it?
Don't you know?
Is it simplicity?
Isn't it obvious?
Is it simplicity, the main point, though? Or is it just something non-physical?
Richard Swinburne is saying that God is simple because he's a single entity.
Yeah.
How can he be a single entity if he's simultaneously controlling the universe, every particle in the universe? He's forgiving our sins. He's giving us free will. He's deciding whether or not you'll die or not on a certain day. Such a thing is not a single, simple entity. It's a highly complicated, mammoth, great, big, fat entity.
Well, take another example of a very simple entity. A particle of matter here. This particle of matter is influencing all sorts of other particles of matter all over the universe. How can it do that with just being one particle of matter? Well, it does, according to the law of gravity.
Well, yes, so what? I mean,
Well, you were saying that in order to have a large number of effects, it had to be a big thing.
in order to do the things that God is supposed to be doing, he cannot be simple. He's an entity of subjective consciousness. He thinks about things. He has free will. He has the power to influence anything in the world that he wants to do. He even does the things that the Christians believe and all the other religions believe. How can you possibly say that such an entity is a single, simple entity?
Well, I'm giving you the example that an entity which is a pretty small and unconscious entity can have a very large number of effects. And if God can have a very large number of effects and yet be virtually even smaller than an electron, in other words, having no spatial extension, why shouldn't you say so? It is the nature of science to postulate entities which are unobservable and have strange properties in order to explain observable entities. We postulated atoms, etc., with their properties in order to explain regular combinations of substances by weight and volume. We postulate fundamental particles to explain this. These fundamental particles turn out to be rather strange in having both wave-like and particle-like properties. But if they are able to produce this effect, then that's reason for believing them to be true. And of course you need an omnipotent being in order to produce all that, but you should go for the simplest one you can have. And the simplest one will have simple properties, and it will not be extended, because if it is extended, it would have parts, and they would have ways of behaving.
I think this section is interesting because Richard Swinburne is trying to describe some of God's properties. Richard Dawkins is trying to suggest that God is complicated and he has to go around and somehow, in a ridiculous manner, and it is ridiculous that God has to push, he's the causal agent for each of the electrons, why they behave the way they do, because God is actively in there causing these motions. Yet if we couple Swinburne, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, if we couple his ideas with LDS doctrine and insert faith, God works on faith. He has faith that the electrons will behave, and they will, when two electrons are next to each other, that they will repel each other. He doesn't have to push each one. He has faith. The causal agent is his faith that the electrons will behave as he wants them to behave. They will follow the electron, that is, in some way will be obedient to God's commandments, if you will. And it's not, of course, just the electrons, it's all of matter that obeys. And under that new perspective, I think it becomes very interesting to talk about cause and effect, why things act the way they do. God doesn't have to be pushing each particle along. It's his faith that causes these particles to behave in the way they do. Well, I thought I would touch a little more on this faith concept. We're stuck in this cause and effect world, and we're trying to think eternally, and it's impossible in the state we're in. However, I thought I actually have the lectures on faith with me, and I thought it'd be useful to just read a couple little sections to you. It says, if men were duly to consider themselves and turn their thoughts and reflections to the operations of their own minds, they would readily discover that it is faith, and faith only, which is the moving cause of all action in them, that without it both mind and body would be in a state of inactivity, and all exertions would cease, both physical and mental. Now, this comes from the very first lecture, actually page 1, and there's a couple more little pieces here. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. By this we understand that the principle of power which existed in the bosom of God, by which the worlds were framed, was faith, that it is by reason of this principle of power existing in the deity that all created things exist, so that all things in heaven, on earth, or under the earth, exist by reason of faith, as it existed in him. And one last little part here. Had it not been for the principle of faith, the worlds would never have been framed, neither would man have been formed of the dust. It is a principle by which Jehovah works, and through which he exercises power over all temporal as well as eternal things. So that's why I was really attracted to this. I was thought of this, the lectures of faith, when Richard Swinburne was talking, because it parallels exactly what Joseph Smith was talking about. So something more interesting to think about.
I just wanted to actually ask the question, because this is something that's really been puzzling me for a long time, how a being or an entity that is so different from ordinary mid-sized objects with causal powers can have the causal powers to bring about everything there is here. So I think that's something many people find very puzzling. And when you made the comparison with fundamental particles, and your argument was, well, we postulated these entities at some point. Eventually, we continued. The scientific story continued. We managed to unravel some of the mysteries. Those particles became less mysterious. The question popped into my mind, well, do you think potentially this is something that could happen with the divine entity as well? Like, because you made this comparison, so can science ever get to a point where perhaps, God is an unraveled mystery?
Well, of course, I don't know where science will get to, but what science will get to is a scientific law. I don't know what the law will be, but it doesn't matter what the law will be. It may get to a beginning, or it may not, but it will get to laws. And laws are claims about how every particle or whatever it's made of is going to behave in certain respects in exactly the same way. And I agree with Richard's point. You can think that as a defining characteristic of the constituents. That's fair enough. But the question is why the constituents have just the same finding. And that's why if you can you need to get beyond that if you're to have an explanation, because you've reached a terminus where everything is behaving in exactly the same way. And so it's worth looking at the other mode by which we explain things and explain personal behavior. Explain personal behavior in virtue of the powers of people. We've all got powers, pretty limited ones, and they differ a bit with each other, what we can do. We've all got beliefs, and that influences what we do. We've all got desires that influences what we do, and the beliefs influence the steps that we take to influence our desires. So, if you can explain in terms of one entity, it's not going to be a scientific one, but it could be a personal one, because you can explain it in terms of someone who is something like us. And remember, the Genesis starts with the God made humans in his image after his likeness. There are similarities, and the similarities are that in this respect he is a personal being. But of course his powers are immensely greater, and his knowledge is immensely greater, and his desires are for the good. We've got all this model. It's all ready. We've just got to blow it up a bit. It's ready there to explain things.
I love this part as well. It's, we are gods in embryo. We have limited mastery over our own bodies and trying to get them to behave. I think, and my hand instantly responds and obeys, and it just seems like magic. And God is the manifestation of how Richard calls it, blowing up this model. My scale being thinking, having faith that I can move my arm and it moves. It obeys my command. That's the small scale. And then we blow up this model we end up with a God who thinks and the universe obeys. The very matter of the universe obeys. So I thought that was a very interesting perspective that he brought up, the scalability of what we can see ourselves do and what God could ultimately do on a larger scale.
Interesting, Richard Swinburne. There's quite a few students in the audience today, and I think tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students studying religious studies in the UK have to study your response to the problem of evil as part of their exams. So I think it would be really interesting to go into a bit here. You mentioned in your opening statement that a God of the type you believe in would give us the opportunity to choose good or evil, to be free, and that's not a luxury that God himself enjoys. And then you might think that things like delicate topics, like people who are suffering with cancer or the genocides and wars and natural disasters, I think it'd be quite a difficult thing to say to somebody who's going through those indescribably problematic events that, you know, this is a great way for you to develop your character. This provides the opportunity for you to be good or to leave this horrible regime, or this is a great challenge for you to overcome, curing cancer. And that seems like a difficult pill for a lot of agnostics who would like to move towards theism to swallow. Would you like to
you'd like a lecture on the problem of evil?
Well, I'd like to know what you'd say to someone who
well, I wouldn't say that to a person suffering. This is you have to just console them. It would be that's not what they want, an argument. But when they've got over their suffering, or when you are asking the question when you're not suffering and standing back and wondering why there is evil, then there is, I believe, an answer. All right? Well, it does start from human free will. God gives us, makes us what I would call mini creators. He gives us a share in his creative work. And he gives us a choice, which he doesn't have, of the sort of world we want to be, the sort of people we want to be, the sort of people we want our friends to be, the sort of people we want the world to be. And it will only be a real choice and matter if the bad choice has bad effects. If it was just a toy world where it was made little bad effects and little good effects, then people would think it wouldn't matter whether you were good or not. It's got to matter a lot. And, of course, it does matter a lot. We are in that position.
To jump in here, just so, because we've unpacked the character building and the reasons why the world's better because it contains those evils. I wonder how much evil would there have to be for you to say, now there's too much? How many people would have to die in these events?
I wouldn't wish to put a number. How can you count these things? But I would make the point that, although it may not seem to the audience, 100 years is a very short time compared to an everlasting time. And if people suffer too much, they just die. There is clearly a limit. Whether it's too big or not, it's very difficult to decide. I don't think it is too big. But once you get the idea that it's somewhere along this line, it's a good thing, and too much would be, then it becomes just a matter of degree. But of course, there are evils which are not produced by humans, natural evils, disease, accident, etc., etc. And these two give choices to us how to deal with it. Are we going to keep all the food to ourselves, or are we going to share it? Are we going to feel sorry for ourselves, or are we going to try and cheer other people up? There are always choices for the sufferer as well as for the malevolent person, or a person who might be malevolent.
Can I just interject here with one thing? So you say that there's like eternal happiness of heaven, of everlasting unity with God. It's nothing compared to finite suffering here in the world. But for for a lot of Christians, there is a place of this everlasting, infinite pain and suffering, isn't there? So doesn't it not balance out on the whole?
Well, I don't think that what you're saying is that I think that a lot of people suffer in hell. I don't think anyone suffers in hell except through their own choice. That is to say, one of the the worst condition of humans can be to be full of hatred. And if they continually reject the good, I don't mean they reject the tenets of Christian belief. I mean they reject all the good they see and out for selfishness and are quite happy to exterminate people and torture people. And they've lost their sense of the goodness. And they wouldn't be happy in heaven. They wouldn't want to be in heaven. But heaven is for people who love the good and want the good. And most of us are not fitted for heaven, even at the end of our lives. And indeed, both Catholic and Orthodox Christianity allow for that possibility that we will end our lives without our fate being heaven or hell. On the Catholic view, as it were, the only alternative is purgatory, and in the end we'll get to heaven if we're put in purgatory. The Orthodox allow the possibility that we might go either way before the general resurrection. That is to say, our fate might not be determined at death. We might have to show ourselves one way or the other eventually.
Just to open the discussion up here, Silvia, do you want to interject on this point?
Sorry, I would like to ask a question. Actually, it's a question for Richard Dawkins, but inspired by what you just said. So, and it sort of, I think, illustrates my point of view. There is so much beauty in what you just said, and I can
so much
beauty in what you just said, and it gives a certain perspective on our otherwise completely random existence. And it gives people dignity. So I was just reminded of the novel by Henryk Sienkiewicz, Quo Vadis. It was turned into a popular Hollywood movie, but I'm talking about the actual novel that he received the Nobel Prize for. And it describes the persecution of Christians under the rule of Nero in ancient Rome, so early Christianity. And it was so atrocious what they did to Christian people back in the days. And their belief, their faith gave them such dignity when they had to face the most horrible, horrible things that were being done to them. And I found that extremely moving. It's impossible to ignore the kinds of power that a religion and a religious belief can unfold. And it's something I think, as a philosopher at least, I want to respect. And that's something that belongs onto the syllabus of every good philosophy undergraduate course. My question for you, Richard Dawkins, is on your worldview, what do you make of the belief of so many people in the world who are theists or have theistic inclinations? I'd say it's, we spoke about the numbers, or I mentioned them in the book. I think it's at least 95% or some number like that.
7% of the world are non-religious.
That's right. 7% of the world's population self-identify as atheists. So the vast majority of people have at least some kind of theistic inclinations, whatever exact form they might be taking. Are all of these people only deluded? Is that the only thing we can say about that?
Yes.
Okay then.
I mean, what argument are you making? We don't decide such things by majority vote.
No. So what I'm trying to say is that besides offering an explanatory competing hypothesis to questions about the first instances of our cosmos, or perhaps about whatever sustains the cosmos, religion and theistic belief does so much more. And I think there should be a place in any philosophy thinking about this that respects all the different functions and benefits that theistic belief has.
What more are you thinking of? What you say does so much more? What are you thinking of there?
Sorry?
What are you thinking of when you say religious belief does so much more?
Well, it makes sense of, as I said, it gives a sense to something that is otherwise completely unexplainable. When we look at the ethical dimensions of religious belief, it can give people guidance, how to behave, how to act with one another. It can give answers how to, as Richard Swinburne just explained to us, it can give us a way of facing, extremely difficult life situations, etc., etc.
It gives comfort and consolation.
Somehow it sounds a little bit like, well, it's, to me, I feel like it's a little bit more than that. When you say it like that, I assume what you have in mind is that it comforts us the way wishful thinking sometimes comforts us. That's exactly what you mean.
Yes.
So what do you make of the fact that there are people who are extremely educated, who have read your books, who know their way around in the natural sciences, and yet hold on to theistic beliefs?
Well, many of them, if you actually ask them what they believe, it turns out that they are what they might call spiritual.
What's the difference?
Well, I'm spiritual. When I look up at the stars, when I look up at the Milky Way, I have an overwhelming emotional reaction to that. And you could call that spiritual. So when you say that highly educated people in science are religious, you want to ask them, do they actually believe, for example, that Jesus is the Son of God? Do they actually believe they're going to survive their own death? I would ask them that sort of question. Do you think that the people you're talking about believe they're going to survive death?
Yes, I think I cannot speak so much for the Christian point of view, but I know of quite a few people who are scientists and who are observant Jews and who believe that the halakha, the Jewish law, is literally true.
Yes, but do they believe they're going to survive death?
Oh, it's a question.
That's a big question.
It's a question that doesn't have the same prominent place in Judaism as it has in Christianity.
That's why I asked it. I asked it precisely because that is a scientific question. The brain is what does the thinking. When the brain decays, do you think you're going to survive death? Do you think you're going to survive death?
I don't know. I wish I had such a firm answer to it.
Well,
but I certainly don't think that I should dismiss somebody who believes it for good reasons. Good reasons meaning, a certain upbringing, a certain conviction that their religious tradition has a point, should just be disqualified as people who are engaged in wishful thinking.
Just to interject here to bring Jessica in for a moment. Just a point of agreement, though. I think Richard Dawkins is fine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, with those who are culturally Christian, who enjoy collective comings together and community building and the artworks and all. There are some good things that come out of religious community, which I think you'll both agree give people a sense of purpose and togetherness, strength, etc., and beautiful, wonderful art as well. The point, the disagreement, though, is that it's just wishful thinking in terms of the scientific hypothesis that.
Yes, I mean, the music and the art we're certainly agreed about.
Yeah.
And there's no question about that. The beautiful literature, the Book of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, these are wonderful poetry. I gather they're even better in the Hebrew than in the English, but they're pretty good in English. But so what? I mean, that has nothing to do with the truth of propositions, which is a scientific proposition that when the brain decays, your personality survives. That is a scientific proposition, which seems to me at least very, very improbable indeed.
All right, there are several. So that was a long section we listened to. The first, I'll break it up into just a few quick pieces here. One is the problem of evil. I think Richard Swinburne covered it quite nicely, and it matches quite well with LDS doctrine in that this earth wasn't made to be a paradise. It was meant to be. It was pronounced good, and that was good for us to provide us challenges, as described by Richard, for us to be able to get the best growth to be able to figure out who we are and why we're here and make decisions and so forth. So I won't say much more about that because he did a really good job. The other part is sort of the afterlife picture, and it was mentioned briefly, and I actually had to look this up, the Jewish belief on the afterlife, and I wasn't quite sure what to conclude other than it was mentioned that the afterlife is not mentioned in the Torah. But in LDS theology, it's mentioned quite a bit. It's not a binary solution. It's not heaven or hell. There are lots of mansions for people, so to speak. After this life, there are degrees, it's plural. The murderers will be with the murderers, the liars with the liars, the righteous with the righteous. There's a place for everybody. The murderer's not going to want to be where God dwells, and there's lots of divisions and places to go, and people won't be basically thrown to hell because God hates them or something, because that's where that's the kind of person they are, and that's where they will be the happiest, is to be in this place that I would find hellish. But so it's more a matter of perspective, I guess. And then it was mentioned, what would I call it? Those who, how was it put? Those who are versed in the natural sciences. It's talking about how is it that these people who understand science and have read Dawkins' books, which I have, and I even encourage people to read Dawkins' books, because I strongly believe if you read his books, you actually have a greater testimony. Oddly enough, he's meant to try to come out and provide evidence that there is no God, but after reading his work, I find just the opposite. I find his difficulty in explaining his position makes it clear that there is actually a God. And as someone who knows his way around the natural sciences as well and has faith, this would be perfect opportunity to bear testimony. But I'm only going to mention one artifact, and that's the Book of Mormon. Because a lot of my testimony you could just write away as well. It's just his opinion. But when you have this physical thing called the Book of Mormon, and you have to explain where it came from, that makes it difficult. How did this young man write a 600-page book in 66 days? And if you've read the book, it is very complicated. Lots of characters, lots of stories, lots of things going on. It's no way a kid who would have had the equivalent of, say, a fourth grade education could have produced a masterpiece like this. I'm not even interested in whether it's true or not. It's just the literary work itself, and the fact that this kid could not have written this in the amount of time that he wrote it, to me, no pun intended, speaks volumes as to the validity of the source of where it came from, which is the actual people in the Mesoamerica writing it down and hiding it, and then having them, Joseph Smith finding them in Hilkamore and so on. So that is how I'll leave this video, is take a peek, examine the Book of Mormon yourself, actually read it. Don't read videos about it. Find a copy, open it up, read it yourself, and see what you think of it. How do you explain this thing? So we'll end with that.